Okay, so today we're going to talk about really going to focus on the nutritional strategies of equine gastric ulcer syndrome. So we'll touch on some of this other stuff later, but I think the important thing here is that it's more than just free choice hay and no carbohydrates, and that's really what we're going to talk about today. So if we move through just in terms of conflicts of interest, I work with a supplement company, Colado, that has a presence in Australia and the US, and some of my research is generously supported by a US company, MDS Vet, who supply endoscopes. None of that's overly relevant today. We're not going to talk specifically about products per se, but we will touch on some of my research. So we've already touched on this in the last talk. So we know that we have equine squamous gastric disease. This is really closely related to the intensity of lifestyle. So when I think about squamous disease, the harder a horse works, the more intense its lifestyle, the more likely it is to have squamous disease. And so we see prevalences of up to 100% in racehorses in work. And the other big population we see are endurance horses. Because we know those horses have these very high intensity lifestyles. I think of squamous disease like heartburn in people, and I think our clinical presentation is very similar to that. And then we have glandular gastric disease. This is much more analogous to peptic ulcer disease in people, so stomach ulcers in people. And this is really a stress-based disease, and there's a relationship with breed, although, that's maybe not as strong as we originally thought, but certainly we have some data that suggests that maybe warm blood horses are predisposed, as in the breed warm blood. And we have evidence that says that stress, and particularly behavioral stresses, are important. And in the last talk, there was a conversation about, the role of gastric disease and welfare intersecting. And it's really, really important. And that's particularly true for glandular disease. Squamous disease is important from a welfare perspective in terms of the impact of disease. Glandular disease is a two-way street. The welfare of the horse impacts on the risk of glandular disease, and then glandular disease impacts on the welfare of the horse. So it's becoming an increasingly important conversation. In terms of the prevalences, and again, that was presented in the last talk, around 50 to 75% of horses will have some degree of glandular gastric disease pathology in their stomach. And really the question we're going to talk about today, and I always like at the start of my talk to have a talk on, a slide on why do we do this? Why do we spend all this time and effort? And it really is about these horses and making sure these horses are healthy and happy. So these are my three kids. Riding horses, and this is what we do on weekends. And on the left and right there, we have a horse called George. And I'm going to come back to George later, because I think when I look back, I really failed George in some ways in terms of managing his impact of gastric disease and the welfare implications of gastric disease. But George is an honest, tough horse. He goes round. He's still going round. He's nearly 20 years old, and he loves show jumping, loves eventing. We want him to be healthy and happy. In the middle, we have our little pony Bubbles taking my 7-year-old daughter around a cross-country course. We put a lot of trust and faith into these horses. We want them to be healthy, and we want them to be happy. And I think that choice of the word happy is really important. Now, that extension beyond just thinking about welfare as being free from disease, to thinking about welfare being a positive emotional state for the horse, and how that intersects with, in this case, particularly with gastric disease. And that's certainly where we're spending a lot of our time conversation these days in the global context of when we talk about gastric disease. It's gastric disease, welfare, and well-being of horses that all intersect with each other. When I think about squamous disease, this image on the right is what's embedded in my head. And when I think about the risk of squamous disease, as we covered in the last lecture, really what we're thinking about is, under normal mechanism, we have a ball of roughage in the stomach, and that ball is about the size of a basketball. And what it does is it provides physical protection for the dorsal part of the stomach, the squamous mucosa, and stops the acid splash. So under normal conditions, we have relatively limited period of time that the squamous mucosa are exposed to the acid. And we can make squamous disease as complex as we want to make it, or we can make it as simple as we want to make it. But its absolute basics, it is an area that doesn't like acid being exposed to acid, or being exposed to excessive acid. And the natural defense mechanism is this ball on the right-hand side and the saliva that goes along with that, that was discussed in that previous lecture. And so when I'm thinking about the risk of disease, when I'm looking at a horse, I'm asking myself, does that horse have a ball of hay in its stomach or a ball of roughage in its stomach? And is that therefore going to be protective? When we think about risk factors, as I said, we can make it as simple as we like, or we can make it as complex as we like. For me, I think it's very simple. There are three major things that contribute to the risk for squamous disease. That's roughage, that's non-structural carbohydrates, and that's exercise. And we're going to work through each of those. When I think about roughage, it's the amount of roughage, it's the timing of roughage, and it's the type of roughage. And we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking more about type of roughage and chewing than you probably ever really cared to think about before. But I think we need to rethink our idea of what is good roughage for a horse's stomach, because in the modern world, we're moving towards more and more processed diets, more and more towards roughage that looks good for us, but is not necessarily good for the horse's stomach and not necessarily what the horse has evolved to eat. We'll touch briefly on non-structural carbohydrates. That is largely being solved in modern diets, but we do still see occasions where horses are fed excessive carbohydrates, sometimes because there's a need for high calories, sometimes because of tradition and just poor feeding. And then we're going to talk about exercise, and that's the amount and timing of exercise. So no, when I look at an individual horse, I look at those things and I say, this is the risk of what I think that horse might have for squamous disease. And obviously that varies between a thoroughbred racehorse and a warm blood dressage horse. And so that's going to give me my different risks of disease for squamous. Glandular, very different set of risk factors. We're going to come back to that later. So when we think about hay and we say, okay, the horse has free choice hay, but yet we still commonly see horses with ulcers with free choice hay. And one of the questions is, one of the things that I ask people is, how much hay does the horse actually eat? And they'll often answer, oh, the horse is on free choice hay. I said, that's not the question I asked. I didn't ask how much do you offer. I asked how much does the horse eat? And what we want to know is the consumption of the hay is really important. So we see situations, and racehorses would be a good example of this. If we offer a racehorse free choice hay, voluntary intake is only around 1% as fed, and that's way below what we need. We also need to consider that when we're feeding hay, we sort of say a minimum of 1.5% body weight per day. But that minimum of 1.5% body weight is based on dry matter. So here's a study from New Zealand looking at horses being fed hay, fed free choice hay. And what we see is these horses are about 500 kilos. And the bottom line is they're eating about 7 kilos, which is about 1.5%, just below 1.5% body weight per day as dry matter. But when we look at it as consumed, it's closer to 2%. So if these horses are 450, 500 kilograms, they're consuming closer to 10 kilograms of hay a day to maintain that 1.5% dry matter. So if I see a horse with squamous disease, the very first question I ask the owner is, how much does this horse eat hay? And is that a minimum of 2% body weight when we're talking about hay? We're going to talk about silage and grass in a little bit because it's even more than that. So if we think about silage, which is perhaps not a common feed in that part of the world, but if we think about silage in some parts of the world, feeding silage is common. Silage has a lot more water, and now we're looking at closer to 4% body weight. So we're looking at horses consuming, 20 kilograms a day of silage to maintain the same basic dry matter intake of 1.5%. So again, it's getting move away from thinking about the idea of, oh, the horse has free choice access to hay, to actually thinking how much hay is getting into the horse's stomach and therefore how protective that might be. And then we think about grass, and it's really common. We have this emotive idea that horses out on pasture won't get ulcers because it's natural. And I think horses, I'm a big fan of the 3 F's of world horse welfare, which is friends, forage, and freedom. And so I think they're 3 critical elements that horses must have. Horses should have turnout from a welfare perspective. But from a gastric disease perspective, it's not quite that simple. If we look at studies looking at pasture turnout, in this particular study, horses turned out to pasture were 3 times less likely to have squamous disease, which fits with this sort of idea that pasture is good for horses. Then we move to another study, which is polo horses in Canada. And you can see that horses that turned out to pasture were about half as likely to have squamous disease as horses that weren't turned out to pasture. So again, it sort of fits with what we think, and we like that. But then if you look at the duration, horses that were turned out for longer were 3 times more likely to have disease than horses that were turned out for short periods. And that doesn't make sense. It's like, hang on, if grass is protective, the longer they're out, the more protective it should be. And in fact, we see the reverse effect here. And then we go to this study from New Zealand where we see there was no difference in horses between being turned out part-time, full-time, or not at all. There was no difference in the prevalence of disease. And there are multiple studies coming through the pipeline that reinforce this, that in fact, the being turned out to pasture on its own is not protective against squamous disease. And so we have to step back and think about that and think about why that might be. We're going to talk about the timing of exercise in a little bit, and that is potentially relevant to this. This is a thoroughbred racehorse study. These horses are exercised first thing in the morning when their stomach's naturally empty. So that's one potential cause. But the other thing is to think about grass and what is grass and how does grass look, and go back to the concept of that roughage ball. So if we think about that roughage ball and we think about grass, if you take lush, rich, modern improved pasture and you chew it up, you don't make a firm roughage ball. You make grass soup, and that soup is going to splash around and not provide the structural integrity. The other thing about modern pastures is they can be very, very high carbohydrates. They can be up to 25% carbohydrate. And so we worry a lot about carbohydrate in the concentrate feed that we feed these horses, but then we go and put them on a pasture that looks lovely. It's lovely looking pastures. The horses overall look great on it because it's very high calorie. But from a gastric point of view, we're putting a lot of carbohydrate in there. And then the third thing is to think about how much does a horse actually eat when it's out on pasture. So if we look at modern pastures, a lot of horses out on pasture, the pasture is quite short. The pasture will often be heavily grazed and quite short. And the question is, are they actually even consuming enough? So we go back to our study and say, well, how much does a horse eat if it's out on pasture? And free choice grass is between 45 and 60 kilograms a day. So, that's up to 10% of their body weight per day eating grass. Now that's maintaining, if you look at the bottom there, it's maintaining the same dry matter intake, about that 1.5%, just below 1.5% dry matter intake. But because grass has so much water in it, they need to eat basically 3 to 4 times as much to maintain the same caloric intake. So I'd ask a lot of people, when you look at your pasture and when you look outside, ask 3 questions. What's that pasture made of? Is that pasture stalky, thick, roughage type grass, in which case it's going to form a nice fibrous ball, or is it lush, loose, sloppy grass that when it gets chewed is going to form soup? What's the carbohydrate content of that grass? And then the last thing is there enough of it? Can the horse actually consume enough grass to be making a roughage ball in its stomach? And in the majority of cases, those 3 conditions are not met. And that's why I think we see this type of finding, which is, yep, going out to pasture for a short term might be protective, but we see over time we lose that effect because effectively we're getting that roughage ball disappear from the stomach. So we go back to our roughage ball and we really want to think about, what is that hay going to look like when we chew that hay up and the horse chews that hay and puts it in its stomach? What's it going to look like? And so we move away from short stem fiber. We move towards long stem, stalky, rougher grass. And it's sort of the idea is, if you go into a hay barn, everyone wants to go to the nice, soft, leafy alfalfa type hay. And we'll talk about alfalfa has some benefits, but everyone wants that nice, soft, leafy hay. When in fact, what we want is the stalky, chewy hay, so that the horse is getting this nice, firm, fibrous ball in its stomach. And the stalky, chewy hay requires more chewing, which makes more saliva and therefore more buffering. So we need to rethink what is good horse hay in terms of gastric protection. What else can we do? We can play around with how horses eat, and particularly how horses eat overnight. So this is a study looking at horses' eating behavior overnight and various interventions of that. If we look at this on the left-hand side, we have a traditional feeding where we basically have a horse following it from 5 o'clock at night through to 6 o'clock the next morning. And we have the horse being fed from a single hay net. The dark lines on the bottom are the amount of time the horse spends eating. And then the dark lines on the top are resting. And then the sort of the white lines in between are the amount of time sort of spent just idle, not really doing anything. And what we can see is that horses don't eat 24 hours a day. That's a really common misconception. Horses around about 10 o'clock at night dramatically reduce the amount of time. They'll still pick through the night, but they dramatically reduce their time budget from fairly constantly eating down to about 20% of the time. And as we saw in that last talk, when that roughage, as that roughage consumption goes down, the pH in the stomach starts to go up, especially at the level of the Margo plicatus. So we have this 8-hour window where horses naturally don't eat very much overnight, and you get this buildup of gastric acid in the stomach. So what they did in their study is they said, well, what happens if we change that? What happens if we give the horse multiple sites of feed? And we know that if you give horses more than one site, so if you have a horse in a stable with a walkout and you have feed inside and feed outside, they will spend more time grazing than if they have a single site of feed. They like to mimic that normal natural behavior of grazing. And then the other thing they did here was put this feeder into slow feeder hay nets. So they were 1-inch holes using slow feeder hay nets. And so what do we see? Well, we see instead of stopping eating about 10 o'clock at night, these horses eat through till about 1 o'clock in the morning. And we also see that they start eating earlier in the morning. So instead of spending about 8 hours a night not eating, these horses are only spending about 4 hours a night where they've dramatically cut down on their time budget for eating. And so we've really shortened that window of the acid building up in the horse's stomach. But what you can see is if you look at the top, it doesn't change their resting behavior. They still get, horses need about 3 hours of sleep, and they still get this good period of active rest or solid rest. They're just doing less of nothing in between. And so arguably it's also good for welfare, particularly for stabled horses. It's good for welfare that they're actually got something to do, not just standing around with nothing to do. Now, one of the things that happens when you talk about feeding horses hay is everyone says, well, what about these, chunky monkeys? What about these overweight horses? And we know that obesity is a real problem in the modern world and we need to manage it. But restricting their hay is not the answer. It's what we used to do, but removing their hay is not the answer. Selecting different hay, looking for lower nutritional quality hay, and maintaining volume is the answer. And an extreme of that is going towards straw. And straw got originally demonized in the gastric ulcer conversation by some work done by Nana Lutherson, who's also on this study. In Denmark, one of the original studies showed that if straw is the only roughage source, you increase your risk of squamous and glandular disease. But what they've done recently is Nana and her group have gone back, led with Pat Harris as well, who's a leading nutritionist in the UK, have gone back and said, but what if we meet some middle ground? What if it's not about extremes? And what if we take the diet to be 50% straw and 50% basic hay? What they showed here is when you do that, there's no increased risk of squamous disease or of glandular disease. So the idea that straw causes ulcers is relative to how it's fed or the percentage of diet it makes up, but it's considered safe at up to 50% of the diet, which is what they're doing in these studies. Look at this guy. This is one of our horses. This is Leo. He's one of our he's a 1-star three-day event horse. And what I want you to do is look at him sort of sitting there chewing his hay. And this is the hay that he's getting fed. We cut this hay ourselves. We cut it deliberately very late. We let it get stalky and we let it get dried out so that I call this hay munchy hay. So the idea is not our key, bulk of our calories or diet. This is so that the horse has something to chew on all day. What I want you to do is look at Leo's behavior there and look at a number of things. So look at how much he actually is eating. Not very much at the moment. What he's done is he's emptied his hay net in the morning, had the stuff that he really likes, and now he's basically just picking through this. But if you watch his jaw, it's constantly moving. Every time he moves that jaw, he makes saliva and he swallows saliva and we get natural buffering. So we're not getting a lot of consumption here with this munchy hay, but what we're getting is a lot of buffering and saliva coming down. Look how relaxed he is. Look how calm and relaxed he is. This horse did a 1-star cross-country course less than an hour before this, and he's a pretty relaxed kind of guy, but look how happy and relaxed he is back in his stable. You say, well, we're going to feed lower quality hay in our competition horses. What about their body condition? Well, his friend in the background there is a horse called Bondit. He's also about 20 years of age. If you look at Bondit, he's in good body condition, eating the same diet. Why? Because we top up their needs from the munchy hay. The munchy hay is there for bulk and background. We top that up with appropriate concentrate feeding to maintain body condition and to meet their other nutritional needs. In terms of gastric ulcers, the proof is really in the pudding. We ask a lot of our horses. During the competition season that runs for about 8 months, we travel 2 to 3 weekends a month, and we'll typically travel 6 to 8 hours to a competition in each direction. So 6 hours on Friday out, 6 hours on back on Sunday. So we ask a lot of our horses, and we put them through, a lot of the risk factors that we would associate with squamous disease. At the end of last season, I scoped my horses and none of them had squamous gastric disease. And I think that really is because of this munchy hay. I think it's this capacity for them to just continually chew and chew and chew is the major factor that protects their stomach. Taking straw a little bit further, there's other studies looking at this. So this is looking at chew cycles. So on the left, we've got a 50% straw diet. On the right, we've got a controlled diet. And you can see that the horses are chewing the same amount with the straw than they are with the controlled diets. If we actually look at their intake, we can see that they're consuming about half as much. By day 7, that 1.06, they're consuming about half as much overall. So now we have a horse that is eating a lower calorie diet, voluntarily eating less of it, but maintaining its chew cycle and has no increased risk of gastric disease. So this straw has really evolved and changed the way we feed these obese horses. And really, it's a very powerful welfare tool that we don't need to starve them to make them lose weight. We can actually keep forage in front of them. We've just got to redefine the idea of what is good forage for that particular horse type. Okay, what if we can't feed, ad lib hay? Well, this was a study looking at horses in Iceland. What they did, same group, Nana Lutherson, Pat Harris, what they did was they took horses from the field in Iceland, scoped them, and then put them in stables and managed them. The horses in the field had a 75% prevalence for squamous disease. When they managed them, that went down to 25%. They asked, what are the things that made the biggest difference in terms of management? And the frequency of forage feeding was one of them. So horses getting fed 3 or more times a day were nearly 20 times more likely to have spontaneous resolution of their squamous disease than horses getting fed twice a day. So if we have a stable situation where it's not possible for whatever reason to feed ad lib hay, if we can get the managers of the stable or the owners of the stable to move from 2 times a day to 3 times a day, we can make a really big difference in squamous disease risk. And I think it's important that we learn to meet owners in the middle. We could say it's free choice or nothing, then they do nothing. Or we can say, well, look, we understand that there's management reasons why that's not possible, but if you can do this, you can still make a really big difference. So it's the frequency of forage feeding that makes a really big difference. There's also some evidence, it's weak evidence, but it's there, that suggests that horses that are eating from ground level chew twice as much than if they're eating from shoulder height. So just taking the same hay and putting it down on the ground has some real potential benefits for gastric health. And I think there was a conversation about that earlier in terms of biomechanical stuff as well. And then we loop back to this idea of pasture turnout. And we need to recognize that a horse that's turned out on pasture still has a risk of squamous disease, that grass is not inherently protective per se of squamous gastric disease. So what we want to think about is that if we're going to exercise that horse, and exercise is the key period where the damage occurs, we want to top that up. So we want to think about pre-exercise feeding. And this is where our alfalfa comes in, because it's highly palatable and because alfalfa has natural buffering capacities. So I'll use a grass hay as my base diet, and then I'll pre-exercise feed with alfalfa to really buffer and protect, build up and optimize those natural defense mechanisms. One of the worst things I think that's happened in the last 5 to 10 years in horse feeding has been this preference towards feeding alfalfa cubes or alfalfa pellets, primarily because they're easy. and they're marketed on the basis that it's alfalfa, it has buffering content, therefore it's good, but it's missing this idea of structure and it's missing this idea of chewing. So if we look at this study here, what we have is we have horses that are either eating hay or horses that are eating pellets, an equivalent amount. And what we can see is that the horses eating hay have a lot more time grazing and less time looking for food, which is the black. So there's a welfare issue with these horses. This is an extreme full pelleted diet. But the bottom is really the important thing. Horses that were eating hay chewed over 4 times as much, 43,000 times a day, versus only 10,000 times a day eating pellets. And it's that chewing behavior and that making of saliva on top of the physical and structural integrity of the hay that's the critical element that we're looking for. Okay, what else is there? Well, hanging out with friends is good. So we have to think about eating is a behavior. And so we want to think about the behavior of eating, and for a horse to eat, it needs to feel safe. And so we know that in a herd situation, horses will spend more time grazing when they're turned out with other horses. And in this study, that translated to a reduction in the risk of squamous disease. So pasture turnout is good. It's just we have to think about it as being more than just pasture turnout. We have to add that roughage back in. In terms of carbohydrates are very important. And what we need to do, though, is think about the amount of carbohydrates. So I think of carbohydrates like red wine. A glass a day of red wine is not going to hurt you. 2 bottles a day is not going to be good for you. And carbohydrates are the same. So if we look at traditional diets where we're feeding very high carbohydrates, what's a high carbohydrate diet? Anything over 1 gram per kilogram per meal of carbohydrates excessive, we know there's an increased risk. When we look at lower carbohydrate diets, we don't need to go to 0 carbohydrate, and there's actually an argument that carbohydrates still have some potential benefit in moderation, particularly in our performance horses. And this is a study that looked at that. And what they basically showed was when they removed the carbohydrates from the diet, there was some difference in the recurrence of gastric disease, squamous disease, which is on the right-hand side, but it wasn't a big difference because these were horses with relatively low carbohydrate diets. And so we need to avoid absolutism. So, and that absolutism of saying no carbohydrates is not true. And people lock onto that, but that's simply not true. What we need to think about carbohydrates is moderate carbohydrates. We need to move away from the old diets, which were very high carbohydrates. But most of our modern commercial feeds that are designed for sports horses like dressage horses and show jumpers, the vast majority of those in North America are already very low carbohydrate, and the carbohydrate's not a driving factor. What else can we do? Feeding beet pulp in this particular study, adding beet pulp to the diet decreased the risk of disease 5-fold. So beet pulp is a relatively simple and cheap thing to add to feed, and including beet pulp in the diet reduces the risk of squamous disease. We also need to think about exercise. So if we think about exercise, we think about a couple of things. So when we look at the exercise, so if we're looking at the right-hand side here, what we're looking at is a pH plot at the margo plicatus, the lesser curvature. And what we see is it goes along at 7 and then all of a sudden drops down to a pH of 1. And 1 is extremely acidic. And that happens at a trot. So basically, once we hit a trot, we're getting exposure of the squamous mucosa to acid. And this is in a horse already with a roughage bull. These horses were on unrestricted hay. So effectively what happens is the horse contracts its abdominal muscles and squeezes at the stomach and lifts the acid up. And transport does the same. Transport mimics exercise, and that's why transport's a risk factor for squamous disease. And what you can see is there's no difference between the T and the G. There's no difference between a trot and a gallop in terms of the acidity of the exposure. So it's not the intensity of the exercise that's the primary risk factor for squamous disease. It's the duration of the exercise. It's a chemical burn, so the longer we have that burn there, worse that burn's going to be. So we want to think about exercise, and we define exercise as anything at a trot or above. And we want to think about the duration of exercise being the risk factor, not necessarily the intensity or duration of exercise. The intensity of exercise. So how long we exercise is central to disease. When we exercise, we talked about this earlier with our racehorse study. Excuse me. When we exercise is important. So Those horses were exercised during the day on a treadmill when they had a stomach full of feed, and you get this coordinated lift in acid that goes up and down. If we exercise first thing in the morning when there's no food in the horse's stomach, then we get splashing. Instead of this coordinated lift up and down of acid, we just get splashing. And this is when we start to see those greater curvature lesions. So this is the classic sort of racehorse lesion. Because they exercise first thing in the morning, you'll get ulcers all the way around the margo plicatus, all the way up into the squamous mucosa. Whereas our sports horses that are on appropriate roughage and tend to exercise later in the day, we tend to see more focal ulcers on the lesser curvature. So exercising first thing in the morning, even when the horses have roughage available, is problematic because they voluntarily don't eat much overnight. So what we need to do is we need to make sure we break that overnight fast. So if we're going to exercise a horse in the morning, we need to make sure it eats something before it exercises. And this is just a graph from my PhD looking at the effect of feeding a meal on the pH of a horse's stomach. You can see it goes from 2 up to about 6 and then stays there for a couple of hours and goes back down. And that was a sort of a half concentrate, half roughage based meal. And so we want to get something into that horse's stomach before it exercises. And again, alfalfa hay is going to be our cornerstone for that. Chaff is going to have some benefit, or pellets are going to have some benefit, but really if we want to get some protection in, it's that hay, partly because we want to form a fiber mat, but more because we want that chewing to start making that bicarbonate and saliva to have that natural buffering. And we can use additional buffering, commercial supplements, marine-derived calcium supplements, as an additional buffer. And if we have a horse that's exercising first thing in the morning and we know that's a risk factor, then that's a very logical, reasonable thing to do. So for squamous disease, our goal is to aim for greater than 2% body weight per day. That's for hay. It's higher when we're thinking about silage or haylage. It's higher when we're thinking about grass. We want to aim for less than 1 gram per kilogram per meal of carbohydrate, non-structural carbohydrate. And our goal is less than a cumulative amount of about 30 to 40 minutes exercise per day. So it's really the cumulative amount over a week, around about that 250, 300 minutes a week. That's where we want to be. If we can put all that together, we're going to go ahead and reduce our squamous risk. But there's some nuances there in terms of timing and that are really, really important that we need to keep in mind. Okay, what about glandular disease? Well, the first thing is to recognize that glandular disease is not primarily a disease of diet. So when we look at all of the epidemiology, squamous disease very heavily comes out with diet. It comes out with roughage and excessive carbohydrates and exercise. When we look at glandular disease, diet is not a feature of the epidemiology of glandular disease. We do know that if you, what I would say is, set off a bomb in the horse's stomach, if you feed excessive carbohydrates, 2 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates, some of these old-fashioned diets where we feed very, very high carbohydrates, that can be damaging to glandular mucosa and can increase glandular risk. But within most modern horse diets, particularly when we think about our most at-risk population for glandular disease, we tend to think about sports horses, our dressage horses, and our show jumpers. Most of those horses shouldn't be eating diets with enough carbohydrate that it's a major driver. So it's not a major driver of disease as long as the horse is on a fundamentally sound diet. And really that's thinking about, the basics of reducing the carbohydrates and having some alfalfa in the diet appears to be beneficial. That's the cornerstone of what we're doing for squamous disease. So we keep doing that and we'll have any potential benefit for glandular disease will be picked up as well. Having oil in the diet. So we haven't really talked about it in detail, but corn oil is a very effective way of reducing non-structural carbohydrate load. When we think about glandular disease, there's some discussion around whether we should be including omega-3s into the diet for their potential anti-inflammatory effects. And we don't have time to go into that detail today. We don't really have evidence to support it, but it makes sense and it's something I'll use selectively in particular cases. But there's a lot more things I think we need to make sure we cross off first before we reach for fish oil or something like that in terms of being the treatment for glandular gastric disease. So what do? We want to think about glandular disease really as a disease of stress. So we want to think about, this is where we get our intersection between welfare, well-being and disease. We want to think about making sure these horses have a regular routine, We know that increasing the number of handlers and riders increases the risk of glandular gastric disease. I think this is probably very horse dependent. Some horses don't care. As long as someone's feeding them, they're happy. Other horses can be really selective and are really sensitive to changes in handlers. I think it's also potentially discipline related. So if you think about a dressage horse, the idea of a dressage horse is to move away from pressure, from a very subtle signal. You change that rider, that can be a much more complex thing for that horse to understand. You can see how that can be behaviorally stressful or frustrating. We know that exercise is a critical element for glandular disease. We know that exercising 5 to 7 days a week increases the risk of glandular disease between 3 and 10-fold, depending on which study we will look at. So it's not the duration of exercise like squamous disease, but there is a relationship, and we aim to schedule at least 2 to 3 days of absolute rest per week. What's absolute rest? The horse can still trail ride, the horse can do something, as long as it's not either behaviorally or physiologically stressful, the horse can still go out and about, but we don't work those horses per study. We need to make sure that we remove confounding stresses. We know that there's some data coming through now that shows that horses with musculoskeletal disease or poor saddle fit are more likely or are less likely to respond to drug treatment for glandular disease, suggesting that the pain from these is driving gastric disease. So we can't just treat the stomach, we have to step back and treat the whole horse. And then we think about this environmental enrichment and this behavior in horses out on pasture. I'm a huge fan that every horse needs a friend. Every horse should have the opportunity to engage in this type of behavior. So, and it's neck to neck behavior that's really important. These two guys are taken to a little bit of an extreme and they're going tail to tail. But these are two retired race horses and they'd lived in stalls for several years. And then as we're part of the rehoming process, we put them together and they just lock onto each other and spend hours and hours and hours in doing this. So I think that in modern horse management, we need to make sure we create the opportunities for horses to have this. It might not be continuous, but we need to create opportunities within our modern horse management systems for horses to be able to do that. It also means doing things like taking their blankets off. So you can see our horses in the back there, they wear blankets because we have a lot of bugs in our area, but it's creating opportunities. So even if we take those blankets off for half an hour or an hour a day to allow the horses to engage in this behavior. And it's really interesting. The two horses in the same paddock will stand there and not really engage that much. And then you take the blankets off and they latch onto each other and really engage in this type behavior. We also want to think about it in terms of stable design. So here's two horses doing the same thing tied up on either side of a gate, and they just basically they're getting ready to be, oh, the one on the right's getting ready to be ridden, the one on the left's just come over to say hello. And these horses just lock on and engage in this grooming behavior because it's so deeply embedded in them. And this is an interesting study looking at stable design where they removed the center partition to allow horses this access. They compared that to a solid wall to a window wall. What they saw was that when you look at the top one, the top thing there is the amount of time the horse is spending on sentient behavior, so alert behavior. And you can see that they spend about half as much time on alert behavior when they've had that opportunity to co-groom. And that bottom one is resting behavior. So you can see it's replaced with resting behavior. So we think about this as a disease of stress. We think about this as a behavioral disease. If we take away that horse's need to feel sentient, it's less stressed, it's more relaxed, it has more time to eat, and more less driver for gastric disease, both squamous and glandular gastric disease. What else can we do? There's others started looking at things like massage and music. And if you had have asked me when I sort of graduated years ago, whether massage and music would be the thing I'd be talking about, I would have said you were crazy. But you know, we have data, so let's look at it. So we have endurance horses here over a 6-month period. We're looking at cortisol, the stress hormone, pre-exercise on the left, post-exercise on the right. And so we can see that solid black line is the pre-exercise cortisol goes down over time as they adapt, but goes up over time as their workload increases. If you look at the squares, you can see that music had a fairly significant dramatic effect on pre-exercise cortisol, but that effect was lost post-exercise. And this was a very particular type of music. It was a very sort of new agey spa type music, and the type of music does matter. And then look at massage. So massage is the triangles, and you can see that massage pre-exercise cortisol reduced to a very low level, and that was sustained post-exercise. So even though these were endurance horses working very, very hard athletically, massaging these horses, they were getting sports massage 3 or 4 times a week. Massaging these horses dramatically reduced the physiological stress response for these horses. And so if glandular disease is a disease of stress, these are the types of interventions we want to think about. And the other thing that's really cool about this study is not only did the horses feel better, they performed better. Horses in the massage group, music group, and to a greater degree, the massage group won more races, won more money, and were generally more successful. So it's not just feel good welfare stuff, it translates through into well-being and performance and closes the loop completely. Very quick study here where they played classical music to horses, and this was Beethoven's Ninth, the relaxing one. These horses spent less time on sentient behavior, more time grazing. So again, these are the types of things that we're looking for, very simple, effectively cost-free intervention. What about supplements? There are a lot of supplements on the market. What I would say is that the vast majority of them have no scientific evidence behind them, and be very, very careful. There are several supplements that have been looked at for squamous disease with variable results, but there are a number of supplements for squamous disease that have been shown to have some benefits in terms of prevention. This is something for glandular disease. There's very, very few supplements that have been looked at for glandular disease. So this is a combination of apolectol, which is pectin lecithin, and magnesium hydroxide. And the principle here was that we were looking to mimic the mucobicarbonate layer from a glandular disease point of view. What we saw was these was a randomized placebo-controlled study. So the horses had were race horses treated with omeprazole, and then we put them on either a placebo or the supplement for 28 days. You can see that the squamous disease, the placebo did what placebo does, which is nothing, and we had reoccurrence back to 75%, which is the baseline for this population, and a relatively low rate of reoccurrence for the supplement group of 27%. And then when we get to glandular disease, it got really interesting. We saw, again, placebo did nothing, 62% is the baseline for that population, but we only had 10%, 1 in 10 of our horses recur for glandular disease. So I think when we think about glandular disease, supplements have a really important role. It's just got to be the right type of supplement. And so as we wrap up, we think of the last couple of things. So the summary for me is with squamous disease, I think of it 80% environment, 20% horse. Get our carbohydrates below 1 gram per kilogram per meal, optimize our roughage intake greater than 2% of their body weight of hay, reduce the quantity of exercise. Think about that interaction between exercise and food. We prefer to exercise them in the afternoon, or we make sure that they've had something to eat before they exercise, especially if they're going to exercise in the morning. Put some beet pulp in the diet, and we're not going to talk about omeprazole today. I always try to manage squamous disease out. Glandular disease, I think, is more of a horse-based disease. I think of it as 80% horse and 20% environment. We focus on environmental enrichment. We do have a role for supplements, and we can use omeprazole. And then just to finish up, we need to close the loop back to these horses and think about this as a behavioral presentation, and that these horses primarily these days present with behavioral signs if it's not weight loss. So weight loss is a characteristic for squamous disease, but glandular disease, behavior is becoming the #1 reason these horses present. And so we need to think about the behavioral implications of this disease. And so this is the type of thing we're looking for when we think about horses out on pasture. We're thinking about horses out. We've got Dylan here on sentient behavior. We've got horses relaxed. We want to think about managing the learnt behavioral response. This is a horse that reacts when he's ridden because of a history of gastric disease. And so we change his environment to make that pre-exercise period more enjoyable and really focusing on the behavioral aspect. And then, basically just thinking about their overall well-being. So with that, I'll finish up shortly. I'll get this fixed in. I do want to mention we have a special issue coming up in animals. If you do research and you're interested in racehorses, please reach out. As a special issue coming up soon, it's something I think that's very valuable. I think there's a lot of welfare work that we can do in racehorses. And I'll put there my contact details. And by all means, please feel free to reach out. By Facebook is as good as anything, or LinkedIn, or directly by email. So with that, I'll thank you for the opportunity to speak. I hope one day to get to Mexico and speak in person, and would happily take any questions.